Imagine living in a world where a single spark could erase everything you owned. No fire engines racing through the streets, no firefighters arriving with hoses and protective gear, no emergency phone numbers to call. For most of human history, this was everyday reality. Fire was both humanity's greatest tool and one of its deadliest enemies. From ancient villages built of wood and straw to crowded medieval cities packed with timber houses, fire was a constant threat. Homes were heated by open flames, meals were cooked over fires, candles and oil lamps provided light after sunset. Blacksmiths, bakers, and craftsmen all worked with heat and sparks. Every day, people lived surrounded by potential disaster. When a fire broke out, it could spread with terrifying speed. Strong winds could carry burning embers from rooftop to rooftop. Narrow streets often acted like funnels, helping flames leap across entire neighborhoods. In some cities, a blaze that began in a single kitchen could consume thousands of buildings before it finally burned itself out. Without organized fire departments, communities had to rely on their own ingenuity. Neighbors formed bucket brigades, passing water hand to hand in desperate attempts to stop advancing flames. City leaders enforced strict building rules. Night watchmen patrolled dark streets looking for the first signs of smoke. Entire districts were sometimes demolished to create barriers against raging infernos. The struggle against fire shaped the design of towns, the laws of kingdoms, and the daily lives of ordinary people. Some civilizations developed surprisingly sophisticated methods to prevent disasters, while others suffered repeated catastrophes that changed history forever. So, before firefighters existed, how did people stop massive fires? The answer is a fascinating story of cooperation, innovation, courage, and survival in a world where one careless spark could transform a thriving city into a sea of ashes.
Long before modern firefighting equipment existed, ancient civilizations understood the destructive power of fire. Cities in Egypt, Greece, Rome, China, and Mesopotamia all faced the same challenge. How do you stop a blaze when your entire city is built from highly flammable materials? In many ancient settlements, the first line of defense was prevention. Leaders knew that once a fire grew large enough, stopping it became nearly impossible. As a result, strict rules governed where fires could be used. Bakers, metalworkers, and potters were often required to work in specific areas away from crowded residential neighborhoods. Open flames were carefully monitored, especially during dry seasons. When fires did occur, ordinary citizens became the firefighters. The most common method was the bucket brigade. People formed long lines stretching from wells, rivers, or public water reservoirs to the burning structure. Buckets of water were passed from person to person in a continuous chain. While simple, this system could deliver a surprisingly large amount of water when hundreds of people participated. Rome eventually developed one of the earliest organized firefighting forces. During the reign of Emperor Augustus, a special group known as the Vigiles was created. Numbering thousands of men, they patrolled the city at night, watched for fires, and responded when emergencies occurred. They carried buckets, hooks, axes, and primitive pumps designed to spray water onto flames. Yet even these efforts often struggled against major fires. Roman buildings were packed closely together, and many upper floors were constructed from wood. If a blaze gained momentum, firefighters frequently resorted to a drastic solution, tearing down nearby buildings. By creating an empty space around the fire, they hoped to deprive it of fuel and prevent it from spreading further. These early techniques may seem primitive today, but they represented humanity's first organized attempts to fight one of nature's most destructive forces, a battle that would continue for thousands of years.
If ancient cities struggled with fire, medieval towns faced an even greater danger. Across Europe, much of the population lived in densely packed settlements, where buildings seemed almost designed to fuel massive infernos. Houses were commonly constructed from timber, with roofs covered in thatch, dried straw that could ignite in seconds. Streets were narrow, buildings often leaned toward one another, and entire neighborhoods were connected by wooden structures. Under the right conditions, a single spark could trigger a catastrophe. Daily life revolved around open flames. Every home contained a hearth for cooking and heating. Candles and oil lamps provided light after dark. Blacksmiths hammered red-hot metal. Bakers operated large ovens, and craftsmen worked with fire throughout the day. With so many sources of ignition, accidental fires were almost inevitable. When a blaze broke out, church bells often served as the town's alarm system. Their urgent ringing could wake sleeping residents and signal that immediate action was needed. Men, women, and even children rushed into the streets, carrying buckets, ladders, and tools. There was no professional rescue team to rely on. Everyone was expected to help. Communities organized bucket brigades, much like those used in ancient times. People formed long lines from wells, rivers, ponds, or water cisterns. Buckets were passed rapidly from hand to hand toward the flames, while empty buckets traveled back in the opposite direction. The system required coordination and endurance, especially when fires lasted for hours. Yet water alone was often not enough. Strong winds could spread flames faster than buckets could extinguish them. In many cases, townspeople resorted to demolition. Entire rows of houses might be torn down using axes and ropes in a desperate attempt to create a firebreak. It was a painful decision, but sacrificing a few buildings could save hundreds more. For medieval communities, fire was not just an occasional disaster. It was a constant threat hanging over daily life, capable of turning a thriving town into ruins overnight.
Most devastating fires began when people were asleep. A candle left burning, a neglected hearth, or a spark carried by the wind could quietly ignite a building in the darkness. By the time residents noticed, flames might already be spreading through entire neighborhoods. To combat this danger, many cities created one of history's earliest public safety systems, the night watch. Night watchmen patrolled streets after sunset while most citizens slept. Armed with lanterns, whistles, staffs, or bells, these guards walked predetermined routes looking for signs of trouble. Their duties included maintaining order, discouraging crime, and most importantly, detecting fires before they grew out of control. The job was far from easy. Medieval streets were often dark, muddy, and confusing. Weather conditions could make patrols miserable, and watchmen were expected to remain alert throughout long nights. Yet their vigilance could mean the difference between a minor incident and a citywide catastrophe. If a watchman spotted smoke or flames, he immediately raised the alarm. Depending on the region, he might ring a bell, blow a horn, beat a drum, or shout warnings through the streets. Residents would rush from their homes and begin firefighting efforts while the blaze was still relatively small. Many cities imposed severe penalties on watchmen who neglected their duties. Authorities understood that early detection was one of the most effective tools against fire. A blaze discovered within minutes could often be controlled. A blaze discovered an hour later might consume an entire district. Some larger towns even established watchtowers that provided elevated views of surrounding neighborhoods. Guards stationed high above the city could spot smoke rising from distant rooftops and alert residents before the danger spread. Although they lacked modern equipment, night watchmen represented an important step toward organized emergency response. Their constant patrols transformed fire prevention from an individual responsibility into a community effort, helping countless cities survive in an age when darkness often concealed disaster.
For centuries, people learned a harsh lesson about fire. Sometimes you could not extinguish it. Once a blaze grew large enough, bucket brigades became overwhelmed, wells ran dry, and exhausted citizens could do little more than watch the flames advance. In these moments, communities turned to one of the most drastic firefighting methods ever devised, the firebreak. A firebreak was exactly what its name suggested, a gap created to stop a fire from spreading. Since flames needed fuel to continue burning, removing buildings, fences, sheds, and other structures could deprive the fire of material to consume. If the gap was wide enough, the blaze might lose momentum and die out before reaching the next section of the city. Creating a firebreak was a desperate and often heartbreaking task. Imagine being ordered to destroy your own home while it still stood untouched, yet that is exactly what many citizens were forced to do. Armed with axes, ropes, hammers, and saws, residents worked together to tear down buildings directly in the path of approaching flames. In some cases, entire streets were demolished within hours. Strong teams of workers pulled structures apart, while others carried away wooden debris that could reignite. Wealthy property owners were rarely exempt. During emergencies, city officials often had the authority to order the destruction of any building necessary to save the larger community. As cities became larger, firebreaks grew more sophisticated. Open marketplaces, wide roads, rivers, and stone plazas were sometimes intentionally incorporated into urban design because they could act as natural barriers during fires. Builders gradually realized that city planning itself could become a weapon against disaster. The use of firebreaks revealed an uncomfortable truth about pre-modern firefighting. Victory often did not mean saving every building. Instead, success meant limiting destruction and preventing an even greater catastrophe. Sometimes the only way to save a city was to sacrifice part of it.
Few events demonstrated the dangers of pre-modern firefighting more dramatically than the Great Fire of London in 1666. What began as a small fire in a baker's shop during the early hours of September 2 would become one of the most famous urban disasters in history. The fire started on Pudding Lane and quickly spread through the city. Conditions could hardly have been worse. London had experienced a dry summer, leaving wooden buildings highly flammable. Strong winds pushed the flames from house to house, while the city's narrow streets allowed the fire to leap across entire neighborhoods with terrifying speed. At first, local authorities underestimated the danger. The standard response was to create firebreaks by demolishing nearby buildings. However, officials hesitated to order large-scale destruction because property owners objected to losing valuable homes and businesses. This delay proved disastrous. As the fire intensified, thousands of residents joined bucket brigades and attempted to save their possessions. Carts loaded with furniture clogged the streets. Families fled carrying whatever valuables they could manage. Smoke darkened the sky, while glowing embers drifted across the city, igniting new fires far ahead of the main blaze. Eventually, authorities ordered widespread demolition to create larger firebreaks. Gunpowder was even used to blow up buildings, creating empty spaces the flames could not easily cross. Although this tactic finally helped slow the fire, enormous damage had already occurred. After 4 days, changing winds and successful firebreaks brought the disaster under control. More than 13,000 houses, dozens of churches, and countless businesses had been destroyed. Vast sections of London lay in ruins. Yet the catastrophe also transformed urban planning. Rebuilding efforts emphasized wider streets and increased use of brick and stone instead of wood. The Great Fire became a powerful reminder that preventing fires was often easier than fighting them. In many ways, it helped inspire the development of more organized firefighting systems that would emerge in the centuries ahead.
Long before modern fire departments existed, inventors and city leaders searched for better ways to battle flames. Buckets and human chains could only do so much, especially as cities grew larger and more crowded. To keep pace with increasingly destructive fires, people began developing new tools that would revolutionize firefighting. One of the earliest breakthroughs was the hand-operated fire pump. Primitive versions had existed in ancient times, but engineers gradually improved their design over the centuries. These machines used pistons to force water through hoses or nozzles, allowing firefighters to direct a steady stream of water toward flames rather than simply throwing buckets. Operating these pumps required teamwork. Several people worked the handles continuously, while others supplied water from nearby wells, rivers, or reservoirs. The process was exhausting, but it could deliver water far more efficiently than bucket brigades alone. Cities also began storing firefighting equipment in public locations. Ladders, hooks, axes, ropes, and water pumps were kept ready for emergencies. Special hooks became particularly important. Firefighters could use them to pull burning sections of buildings apart before flames spread further. In many cases, removing a roof or wall allowed trapped heat and smoke to escape, making fires easier to control. Another innovation involved water storage. Some towns built large cisterns, underground reservoirs designed to provide emergency water supplies during fires. Since wells could become overwhelmed during major disasters, these reserves ensured that firefighters had access to additional resources when they needed them most. As technology improved, cities became increasingly organized in their approach to fire prevention. Equipment inspections, maintenance schedules, and emergency response plans became more common. While these systems were still far from modern standards, they marked an important transition from spontaneous community action toward structured firefighting.
These inventions could not eliminate fire, but they significantly improved humanity's chances of survival. For the first time, people were developing specialized tools designed specifically to fight one of their oldest enemies, laying the foundation for the professional firefighting equipment used today.
Before professional fire departments became common, many governments concluded that the best way to fight fires was to prevent them from starting in the first place. As a result, cities and kingdoms created strict laws regulating how people used fire in their daily lives. One common rule involved curfews for open flames. In many medieval towns, residents were required to extinguish hearth fires or carefully secure them before going to bed. The word curfew itself comes from an old French phrase meaning cover the fire. Evening bells often signaled the time when households were expected to bank or cover their fires for the night. Authorities also regulated dangerous professions. Blacksmiths, bakers, brewers, and other tradesmen who regularly worked with heat were often required to operate in designated areas away from crowded residential districts. Workshops could be inspected, and owners faced penalties if they failed to follow safety regulations. Building codes became another important tool. Following major disasters, many cities prohibited certain construction materials. Thatch roofs, for example, were banned in some locations because they ignited so easily. Officials encouraged or required the use of brick, stone, and tile, which were far more resistant to fire. Punishments for negligence could be severe. Individuals whose carelessness caused fires sometimes faced heavy fines, imprisonment, or public humiliation. In certain periods, authorities treated accidental fire starting almost as seriously as criminal behavior because the consequences could be so devastating for entire communities. Cities also organized regular inspections. Officials checked chimneys, ovens, fireplaces, and storage areas for hazards. Residents were expected to maintain their homes properly and report dangerous conditions before they led to disasters. These laws reveal how seriously past societies viewed the threat of fire. People understood that a single mistake could destroy homes, businesses, churches, and lives. By creating regulations, enforcing inspections, and punishing negligence, governments hoped to reduce the risk of catastrophe. In many ways, these early fire laws were the ancestors of the modern safety codes and regulations that continue to protect cities around the world today.
By the 1700s and 1800s, many cities had grown so large that traditional bucket brigades and volunteer efforts were no longer enough. Urban populations were booming, buildings were packed closer together than ever, and factories introduced new fire hazards. As devastating blazes continued to destroy entire neighborhoods, a new solution began to emerge: organized professional fire brigades. At first, many of these groups were not operated by governments. Instead, insurance companies created their own firefighting teams. Property owners paid for fire insurance, and in return, the company's brigade would respond if their insured buildings caught fire. Some buildings even displayed metal plaques known as fire marks to show which insurance company protected them. These private brigades represented a major step forward. Members received training, practiced emergency procedures, and became skilled at operating increasingly sophisticated firefighting equipment. Horse-drawn fire engines allowed crews to reach emergencies faster than ever before. Improved pumps delivered stronger streams of water, while specialized tools helped firefighters rescue people and contain flames. However, private systems had serious problems. Multiple brigades might arrive at the same fire and argue over responsibility. Buildings without insurance sometimes received little assistance. In major emergencies, competition could interfere with effective firefighting. Gradually, cities recognized that fire protection should serve the entire community rather than individual companies. Municipal governments began creating publicly funded fire departments staffed by trained professionals. These organizations maintained equipment, conducted inspections, and responded to emergencies regardless of who owned the property. The transition was not immediate, but it marked a turning point in history. Firefighting evolved from a responsibility shared by ordinary citizens into a specialized profession requiring skill, discipline, and dedication. For the first time, cities had permanent teams whose primary purpose was protecting lives and property from fire. The age of professional firefighters had finally arrived, ending thousands of years in which communities had largely been forced to defend themselves against devastating blazes.
Today, it is easy to take firefighters for granted. When smoke appears on the horizon, we expect trained professionals to arrive with powerful engines, protective equipment, advanced communication systems, and specialized rescue tools. Yet for most of human history, none of these things existed. For thousands of years, ordinary people stood on the front lines of every fire. Farmers, merchants, craftsmen, laborers, and neighbors became firefighters whenever disaster struck. They formed bucket brigades, demolished buildings to create firebreaks, patrolled streets as night watchmen, enforced safety laws, and invented new technologies in a constant struggle against one of nature's most destructive forces. The story of pre-modern firefighting is ultimately a story of human resilience. Communities learned through painful experience. Every devastating blaze revealed weaknesses and inspired new solutions. Ancient patrols evolved into organized watches. Buckets gave way to pumps. Volunteer efforts became professional brigades. Cities redesigned streets, improved construction methods, and created regulations that reduced risks for future generations. Some of history's greatest disasters, including fires that destroyed entire districts and left thousands homeless, became turning points that changed how societies approached safety. Out of tragedy came innovation. Out of destruction came stronger cities. Even modern firefighting still reflects lessons learned centuries ago. Firebreaks remain important in combating wildfires. Building codes continue to emphasize fire-resistant materials. Emergency planning, inspections, and prevention efforts all trace their roots to ideas developed long before the first modern fire station was built. So the next time you see a fire engine speeding down the road, remember that it represents the culmination of thousands of years of trial, error, courage, and ingenuity. Before firefighters existed, humanity relied on determination, teamwork, and creativity to survive. And while the tools have changed dramatically, the goal remains exactly the same as it was centuries ago: protecting lives, homes, and communities from the terrifying power of fire. And that is how people stopped massive fires before firefighters ever existed.